Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. May 26, 1941. Lake Pontchartrain, New Orleans, Louisiana. Imagine standing at the edge of the water, the breeze carrying the scent of mud and salt, as a peculiar plywood boat repeatedly smashes against a concrete seawall. Each impact makes the hull shudder like a living thing. Then, almost impossibly, it reverses, spins almost in its own length, and charges the wall once more. Commander Ross Daggett of the Navy Bureau of Ships stood there, arms crossed, absorbing every violent motion with a mixture of skepticism and awe. Behind him, Major Ernest Linsert of the Marine Corps Equipment Board scribbled notes so furiously that the ink threatened to run. They had come expecting what? A curiosity, a joke, a fantasy dismissed by the Navy brass in Washington as the rantings of a brawling Irishman with more confidence than reason. Yet what they were witnessing would, in hindsight, alter the trajectory of the Second World War. At the center of this orchestrated chaos stood Andrew Jackson Higgins, the man behind the boat. He was demonstrating a design so radical that Navy engineers had spent 2 decades trying and failing to achieve it, a simple steel ramp on the bow that could drop down, allowing men and vehicles to storm a beach directly. A seemingly small invention, yet in the 4 years to come, that plywood ramp would land more Allied soldiers on hostile shores than all other methods combined. Dwight Eisenhower would later reflect in 1964 that, without it, the Allied plan for victory would have been impossible. Yet this historic moment had its roots not in triumph, but in struggle and failure. In 1931, amid the Great Depression, Higgins Lumber Export Company had been forced into voluntary receivership. A businessman from Nebraska, Higgins had built a fleet of sailing ships to transport hardwood from the Philippines and Central America and constructed his own shipyard to maintain them. But when global trade collapsed, both A.J. Higgins Lumber and Export Company and Higgins Industries were placed under the court's protection, with a sympathetic judge appointing Higgins as his own receiver. He now had a boatyard, towering debts, and a refusal to surrender. The knowledge that would change the course of the war had been forged long before in the mud and marshes of Louisiana. Higgins learned the fundamentals of boat design during a brief stint in the Nebraska National Guard and perfected them out of necessity in the bayous. The shallow, debris-strewn waterways demanded craft that could navigate in just 18 inches of water, surge through tangled vegetation, run over submerged logs, and land on muddy banks without fouling a propeller. Ordinary boats failed spectacularly. Higgins designed something different. His Eureka boat, first developed in 1926 and honed throughout the 1930s, incorporated deceptively simple innovations that proved devastatingly effective. The bow was shaped like a spoon, able to ride up over obstacles rather than crash into them. A solid pine block, the headlog, reinforced the bow, making it the strongest part of the vessel. Capable of absorbing tremendous impacts, the hull was revolutionary, a deep V at the front, flowing into a reverse curve midships and flattening out at the rear to create planning surfaces. This design aerated water flow, reduced friction, and increased speed. Most critically, Higgins built a semi-tunnel into the hull to protect the propeller and drive shaft, enabling the boat to surge onto a beach at full speed and retreat safely. The craft found diverse users: oil drillers seeking access to remote rigs, trappers navigating treacherous marshes, and bootleggers in the waning years of Prohibition, who prized speed and shallow draft for rum running. The boats performed reliably, sustaining Higgins's small enterprise through the Depression, crafted one at a time. His ingenuity and tenacity gave birth to Boat Services Company in 1931, a third venture that purchased vessels from Higgins Industries and leased or sold them to others. Higgins's ingenuity didn't just keep his business alive, it kept nearly 50 people employed during the harshest years of the Depression. By 1935, he had cleared his debts and achieved a rare feat, maintaining solvency while countless other businesses around him crumbled. Yet far from the bayous of Louisiana, events halfway around the world were quietly setting the stage for Higgins's next great challenge. It was 1937, and Japan was advancing into China. American military observers were watching closely. Lieutenant Victor Krulak of the U.S. Marine Corps found himself perched on a Shanghai rooftop that summer, camera in hand, telephoto lens trained on the unfolding chaos below. Japanese troops were executing amphibious landings in the Battle of Shanghai, using boats unlike anything in the American arsenal. These Daihatsu-class landing craft had a deceptively simple, brilliant feature, a bow ramp that dropped down, allowing soldiers and equipment to charge directly onto the beach, rather than climbing over the sides under enemy fire. Krulak photographed the landings, then sent his detailed report back to Washington under the title Japanese Assault Boats, Shanghai, 1937. But the response was dismissive. His superiors filed it away with a note that it was the work of some nut out in China. The U.S. military of the late 1930s was woefully unprepared for amphibious warfare, despite the Marine Corps' growing insistence that such operations would be vital in any future conflict. The Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair had been tasked with producing landing craft, but as Higgins would later note, their designs were worthless. In 1938, the Navy held competitive trials for landing craft, but Higgins wasn't invited. He only learned of the tests after every submitted design had spectacularly failed. Frustrated by the Navy's incompetence, the Marine Corps remembered hearing of a strange, civilian-built boat from the Coast Guard, which had purchased several Eureka boats for rescue operations. They bypassed the Navy entirely and contacted Higgins directly. Bringing his Eureka boat to Norfolk, Virginia for testing that year, Higgins left Navy and Marine Corps officers stunned. The boats performed flawlessly, charging beaches at full speed, reversing cleanly, turning on impossibly tight circles, and maintaining speed in shallow water where Navy designs floundered helplessly. During fleet landing exercises in February 1939, the Marines watched in growing amazement as the Eureka boats conquered conditions that would have destroyed conventional craft. The shallow draft allowed operations in waters that trapped other vessels. The semi-tunnel protected the propeller, letting the boat beach and retreat safely. The spoon-shaped bow absorbed impacts that would have stove in traditional hulls. Yet Washington remained skeptical. The Bureau of Ships, invested in its own decades of design work, regarded this swamps-born civilian as an intruder. The Navy of the 1930s was a clubby world of established shipbuilding giants, political connections, and long-standing contracts. Higgins, with his profane tongue and aggressive personality, was decidedly not a member. In a moment that became legendary, Higgins visited the Bureau of Ships in Washington. When shown the Navy's landing craft blueprints, he took a pencil and scrawled across them, "This boat stinks. AJH." The Navy officers were not amused, yet as their designs continued to fail while Higgins' boats excelled, they had no choice. In 1939, the Navy reluctantly ordered Higgins to build landing craft based on his Eureka design, designated landing craft, personnel, or LCP. The boats were effective at delivering troops to shore, but one fatal flaw remained. Soldiers had to climb over the sides to disembark, exposing themselves to enemy fire. Training exercises highlighted the problem. Men laden with 60 pounds of equipment struggled to clamber over gunwales, and in combat, the process would be lethal. The Marines recognized the danger but had no immediate solution. By April 1941, Victor Krulak had built a balsa wood model of the Japanese landing craft based on his 1937 Shanghai photographs. During a meeting at the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia, he showed it to Higgins, explaining the retractable bow ramp that allowed rapid disembarkation. Higgins studied the model for perhaps 30 seconds, his seasoned eye instantly grasping the implications. He picked up the phone and summoned his chief engineer. Higgins did not wait for Navy approval or contracts. At his own expense, he built 3 prototype boats, modifying his proven Eureka design to include a steel bow ramp. Reinforced and mechanically simple, the ramp could be lowered quickly to allow men to charge 4 or 5 abreast or for a jeep to drive straight onto the beach. When raised, it formed the protective bow. By late May 1941, the prototypes were ready for testing, poised to transform amphibious warfare forever. Victor Krulak would go on to an extraordinary career, rising to lieutenant general and becoming one of the most influential strategists in Marine Corps history. He pioneered helicopter assault tactics that would redefine amphibious operations in the jet age, and authored First to Fight, an inside view of the U.S. Marine Corps, a seminal work on Marine Corps history. Throughout his life, he insisted that the Higgins Boat was the single most important tactical innovation of World War II. He lived to witness its legacy, passing away in 2008 at the age of 95, having seen the boats he helped inspire serve in conflicts from Guadalcanal to the invasions of Iraq. But on that decisive day, May 26, 1941, Commander Ross Daggett and Major Ernest Linsert arrived at Lake Pontchartrain to witness the demonstration that would either validate or dismiss months of Higgins' relentless work. Higgins, ever the showman, did not disappoint. He loaded 36 of his employees into one boat, simulating a fully loaded combat platoon. The craft surged across the lake at 12 knots, riding directly onto the shore as the bow lifted gracefully. With a metallic clang, the steel ramp dropped, and all 36 men charged down onto the beach in seconds, the boat's engine idling calmly behind them. The demonstration continued. The ramp lifted, the boat reversed smoothly off the beach, spun in a tight circle, and repeated the display. Higgins then upped the stakes, driving a truck onto the boat to showcase its vehicle-carrying capacity. The boat approached the shore, beached again, dropped its ramp, and Higgins drove the truck directly onto land without hesitation. The military observers were stunned. This was exactly the kind of craft the Marine Corps had been desperately waiting for in order to execute amphibious assaults. The Navy Bureau of Ships, however, remained hostile. For 2 decades, they had labored in vain to develop a tank landing craft, only to fail. Higgins, a civilian outsider from the swamps, had not only succeeded, but built an effective tank landing craft in 61 hours as a proof of concept. The Bureau despised him for exposing their inefficiency, yet the Marine Corps was adamant they needed these boats, and they needed them in enormous numbers, fast. As war with Japan loomed in late 1941, the Navy finally placed substantial orders for what would become the landing craft, vehicle, personnel, or LCVP. For the troops who would row into hostile beaches, It became universally known simply as the Higgins Boat. The designation would later confuse historians. LCVP referred specifically to the ramped version, distinct from the earlier LCP variants that lacked ramps. At the time of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, Higgins Industries employed fewer than 75 workers in a single boatyard. In 1937, the company's net sales had been $422,000. Higgins immediately understood what the attack meant, not only for America, but for his own business. He began an unprecedented expansion before receiving additional orders, acquiring land near City Park, along the Industrial Canal, and at Michoud in eastern New Orleans. He implemented production lines using assembly techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing, a revolutionary approach for boat building. Traditional boats were handcrafted, built one at a time by skilled artisans. Higgins transformed the process into mass production, with workers specializing in specific tasks along an assembly line. He hired anyone who could work: white men, black men, women, the elderly, even disabled workers. This was groundbreaking in New Orleans and across the South. Higgins Industries became the city's first fully integrated workforce, shattering long-standing racial barriers. All employees received equal wages for the same work, regardless of race or gender. Black and white workers labored side by side. Women operated machinery once reserved for men, and pay scales were determined solely by job rating. When criticized by other Southern businessmen who clung to segregation, Higgins was unflinchingly blunt. In April 1941, he addressed the Southern Conference for Human Welfare in Nashville, delivering a speech on the rights of African Americans that shocked the business establishment. For Higgins, equality was not a matter of politics. It was practical, moral, and inextricably linked to the efficiency of his workforce and the success of his boats. Eleanor Roosevelt, present at the Southern Conference for Human Welfare, called Higgins one of the most enlightened businessmen in America. Higgins' response to critics was characteristically blunt. He needed workers, and he did not care about their color, gender, or background. What mattered was whether they could build boats to the exacting standards required to save American lives. And respond they did, with fierce loyalty and unprecedented productivity. Higgins managed his sprawling workforce with remarkable innovation. Loudspeakers carried his voice throughout the plants, allowing him to address thousands of workers simultaneously from his office. When urgent orders arrived, he would storm the factory floor personally, delivering profanity-laced pep talks that somehow inspired rather than offended. Signs throughout the facilities proclaimed blunt slogans like, "The guy who relaxes is helping the Axis." Every worker understood that each boat they built would carry American soldiers into combat, and a single flaw could cost dozens of lives. Despite the pressure, workers took immense pride in their craftsmanship. They affectionately called him Andy, a name spoken with a mixture of respect and warmth. In August 1942, when Higgins granted a 12.5% pay raise, he urged the workforce to invest the increase in war bonds. They complied without complaint, subscribing at 15% of payroll. By late 1943, Higgins Industries had expanded to 7 manufacturing plants in New Orleans alone. The workforce had grown from fewer than 75 in 1938 to more than 25,000, though some sources cite 20,000 depending on counting methods across the multiple facilities. Net sales had skyrocketed from $422,000 in 1937 to just over $10 million in 1941, reaching $144 million by 1944, with contracts totaling $350 million from the U.S. government. The scale of expansion from 75 workers to over 20,000 in 5 years, was among the most dramatic industrial mobilizations of the war. The 7 plants were located on City Park Avenue, St. Charles Avenue, the Industrial Canal, Michoud, Bayou St. John, and in Houma, Louisiana. At peak production, these combined facilities were producing more than 700 boats per month. The Higgins boat itself was deceptively simple in appearance. At just over 36 feet long and under 11 feet wide, it was small compared to other naval vessels. Powered by a 225-horsepower Gray Marine 671 diesel engine, it could reach 12 knots, though rough seas often slowed it. Plywood sides and rear reduced weight and conserved strategic steel for other war production, offering limited protection but allowing for speed and efficiency. The steel bar ramp gave troops some shielding during their final approach to shore. Its shallow draft 3 feet at the rear, 2 feet 2 inches at the bow, enabled it to run directly onto beaches without grounding. A semi-tunnel protected the propeller, allowing the boat to beach and reverse safely over sand, rocks, and debris. A crew of 4 operated each vessel: a coxswain who steered and controlled the ramp, an engineer managing the engine, and 2 crewmen handling lines and operating 2 .30-caliber machine guns mounted on either side of the front compartment. The boat could carry 36 fully equipped infantrymen, a jeep, and 12 men, or up to 8,000 pounds of cargo. The genius of the design lay not in any single feature, but in the harmonious integration of all of them. The shallow draft allowed approach to nearly any beach. The protected propeller allowed safe beaching. The bow ramp enabled rapid troop disembarkation under fire. The powerful engine and planning hull allowed quick withdrawal and return to transport ships offshore. From approach to landing to extraction, a full cycle could be completed in 3 to 4 minutes, enabling multiple trips per hour and rapidly building forces ashore. The Higgins boat's first combat test came in August 1942 during the Guadalcanal landings in the Solomon Islands, the United States' first major amphibious operation of the war. Success or failure here would determine the viability of all future amphibious assaults. The 1st Marine Division relied heavily on various Higgins landing craft to storm the beaches, testing every feature under the unforgiving pressure of live combat. In combat, the Higgins boats exceeded even the highest expectations of their designers and commanders. They surged up onto the coral beaches of Guadalcanal, dropped their ramps, and disgorged Marines who charged straight into the dense jungle. Despite the jagged coral, the boats reversed effortlessly, returned to the transport ships, and immediately began ferrying more troops and supplies. Within days, thousands of Marines and tons of equipment were ashore. The operation's success owed much to the Higgins boats functioning exactly as designed, and Marine commanders quickly demanded more for future campaigns. 3 months later, in November 1942, the boats were back in action during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. American forces landed at 3 points along the coast: Casablanca in Morocco, and Oran and Algiers in Algeria. Here again, Higgins boats proved indispensable. Conventional landing craft would have struggled with the beaches and heavy surf, but the shallow-draft Higgins boats ran directly onto the sand without difficulty. Troops poured down the ramps into ankle-deep or even dry water, rather than wading through chest-deep surf. The boats reversed off the beaches, returned for fresh loads, and within 3 days, over 100,000 Allied troops and massive quantities of equipment were ashore. Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the operation, sent Higgins a telegram on Thanksgiving Day, 1942, that the inventor would treasure for life. On this Thanksgiving Day, let us thank God for Higgins Industries' labor and management, which has given us landing boats with which to conduct our North African campaign. More power to you. Higgins framed the telegram and hung it prominently in his office, a symbol of vindication. The North African success confirmed the genius of his design and triggered massive new orders from the military. By 1943, Higgins Industries was producing boats at an almost incomprehensible rate. At peak output, the 7 plants rolled out over 700 boats per month. Workers pushed themselves to the limit, operating 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The assembly lines never stopped. Plywood sides were cut to precise specifications, fitted and attached. Engines were installed and tested. Steel ramps, with their mechanical lowering systems, were fabricated and mounted. Boats rolled off the lines and were immediately loaded onto rail cars for shipment to ports across the country and around the world. The scale of production was staggering. By the end of 1943, Higgins Industries had built over 12,000 boats of all types, most of them LCVPs and their variants. These boats served in every theater of the war. In the Pacific, Marines island hopped with them, landing on Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, and dozens of other islands that would become infamous for savage fighting. In Europe, they accumulated in Britain for the invasion that everyone knew was coming, though its timing remained the Allies' most closely guarded secret. Planning for Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion began in earnest in 1943 under Eisenhower's command. He understood that success depended entirely on landing thousands of troops and tons of equipment on French beaches with no ports, open stretches of sand backed by cliffs, and German fortifications 2 years in the making. Only the Higgins Boat could reliably carry out this monumental task. Allied planners calculated that more than 5,000 landing craft would be needed for D-Day alone. Higgins Industries, alongside other manufacturers producing boats under license, was responsible for the majority. Chris Craft built 8,602 LCVPs, Owens Yacht Company 2,150, Richardson Boat Company 604, and Higgins Industries 12,500, bringing the total to 23,348 by war's end. The pressure was enormous. Workers knew the stakes. When Higgins addressed them over the loudspeaker system, he did not mince words. These boats would carry American boys onto French beaches defended by German machine guns. Every boat had to be perfect. A single flaw could mean dozens of deaths. The workforce responded, maintaining high quality even as production soared. By early 1944, southern England staging areas were filled with Higgins boats, sitting in harbors, on beaches, and in rivers, ready and waiting for the order to launch the largest amphibious assault in history. Every Higgins boat was meticulously inspected, tested, and assigned to a specific unit. Crews trained relentlessly, practicing loading troops from transport ships via rope cargo nets, running the boats onto beaches in every imaginable sea state, and unloading quickly under simulated fire. Infantrymen climbed down, swinging nets into pitching boats, each carrying 60 pounds of equipment, a harrowing experience in calm waters, and far worse, in rough seas. They practiced charging down the ramps and assaulting beach obstacles, fully aware that the invasion was imminent. They did not know when or where, but they knew the Higgins boats would carry them there. The date was set for June 5, 1944, but a storm forced a one-day delay. On the evening of June 5th, thousands of boats began loading troops from transport ships anchored off the English coast. Soldiers climbed down rope cargo nets, often losing their grip, falling into the boats or between the vessels and ship hulls. Seasickness afflicted many even before leaving the assembly areas. Crossing the English Channel in rough conditions took hours. Boats plunged through waves, water washing over the bows again and again, men bailing with helmets while trying to avoid vomiting. Some boats leaked badly under the pounding surf. Soldiers sat soaked, shivering, some certain they would not survive the coming hours. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, over 5,000 Allied ships lay off the Normandy coast. Hundreds of transport ships were surrounded by waves of Higgins boats, loaded with troops and awaiting the signal to head for shore. At Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing site, the first wave hit at 6:30 a.m. The boats surged onto the sand, ramps dropped with metallic clangs, and men charged out into knee-deep water. German resistance at Utah was lighter than anticipated. The Higgins boats reversed off the beach successfully and returned to the transports. The operation proceeded almost according to plan. 21,000 troops landed at the cost of 197 casualties, a remarkably low figure reflecting both careful planning and a measure of luck. 15 miles east at Omaha Beach, the situation was catastrophic from the first moments. Omaha was the most heavily defended landing site. German forces of the 352nd Infantry Division, far larger than expected, occupied fortified positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach, armed with machine guns, mortars, and artillery, creating interlocking fields of fire. The pre-invasion naval bombardment, limited to maintain tactical surprise, had failed to destroy these defenses. When the first Higgins boats approached at 6:30 a.m., they were met with a storm of fire. Many were hit before reaching the beach. Their plywood sides offered no protection against machine guns. Others reached shore only to land directly in front of heavily defended sectors. As the ramps dropped, men charged into a hail of bullets. Casualties in the first wave were horrific. Some units lost over 90% of their men in minutes. Company A of the 116th Regiment suffered 96% casualties within the first 30 minutes. Bodies piled on boat ramps, delaying their closure. Coxswains had to crawl over corpses to manually raise the ramps so the boats could reverse. The surviving Higgins boats returned to the transports, loaded fresh troops, and made repeated trips under devastating fire. One operator later recalled making 15 runs to Omaha Beach that day. Each time, men charged down the ramp into lethal fire. Each time, ramps were slick with blood. Each time, the boats carried back as many wounded and dead as possible, using grappling hooks to pull men from the water. 6 boats from his ship were lost that day, yet all crew members survived. 16 men were rescued from the water, and 2 reached shore, grabbed weapons, and joined the fight. By the end of the day, approximately 2,400 Americans had been killed or wounded at Omaha, the highest casualties on any D-Day beach. The shoreline was littered with destroyed equipment, vehicles, and bodies. Yet the Higgins boats kept coming. Reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies continued to flow. Wounded soldiers were evacuated. By evening, American forces had established a tenuous foothold on Omaha despite the carnage. Across all 5 Normandy beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword Higgins boats and other landing craft delivered approximately 156,000 Allied troops on D-Day, 73,000 Americans, and 115 British and Canadian forces. At Omaha alone, more than 34,000 American troops came ashore despite the terrible losses. Over the following weeks, the boats continued round-the-clock operations, ferrying men and supplies from ships to shore. Within a month, more than 850,000 troops, 150,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies had landed on the Normandy beaches, accomplished entirely without capturing a single port. The Higgins boats working alongside larger landing craft and amphibious equipment, enabled the Allies to build overwhelming force faster than the Germans could respond. Dwight Eisenhower's later assessment given in 1964 during his first meeting with historian Stephen Ambrose in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was a measured reflection on what had enabled Allied victory. "He's the man who won the war for us. If Andy Higgins hadn't designed and built these landing craft, we never could have gone in over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." This was no wartime hyperbole. Nearly 20 years after the conflict ended, Eisenhower recognized that the Higgins boat was not just a vessel, but the linchpin that made modern amphibious warfare possible. Without the Higgins boats, the entire Allied strategy would have been fundamentally altered. The Allies would have been forced to capture heavily defended ports before landing significant forces, a daunting, costly, and potentially disastrous undertaking. In the Pacific theater, Higgins boats were equally indispensable. The island-hopping campaign that carried American forces across the Pacific toward Japan relied on amphibious assaults on dozens of fortified islands, each defended by Japanese soldiers ordered to fight to the death. At Tarawa, in November 1943, Marines experienced the brutal reality of opposed amphibious landings. The first waves, carried in various Higgins landing craft, suffered terrible casualties as they crossed the reef and the beach under intense fire. Yet the boats continued to arrive, wave after wave, until enough Marines were ashore to overcome the Japanese defenders through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The battle claimed over 1,000 American lives and left 2,000 wounded, but it established a template for future operations. At Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the pattern repeated. Higgins boats approached beaches in disciplined waves, landing troops under fire, reversing off, and returning for more. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, where 6,800 Americans died capturing an 8-square-mile island, Higgins boats had delivered 30,000 Marines in the first waves. At Okinawa in April 1945, the last major amphibious operation of the war, 60,000 troops were put ashore on the first day by these same vessels. Even during the crossing of the Rhine River into Germany in March 1945, Higgins boats ferried troops under enemy fire, proving their versatility extended beyond traditional beach landings. By the end of the war in August 1945, manufacturers building under Higgins patents, including Higgins Industries itself, had produced 23 358 LCVP landing craft. Higgins Industries alone built 20,094 boats, including 12,500 LCVPs, 199 PT boats, various LCMs and LCTs, and other specialized craft. Collectively, these boats had landed more Allied troops on hostile shores than all other methods combined, participating in every major amphibious operation of the war across Europe and the Pacific. Millions of American soldiers and Marines rode in Higgins boats, and the vessels became so ubiquitous that the troops no longer spoke of LCVPs. They went ashore in Higgins boats, a name synonymous with amphibious warfare itself. Andrew Higgins became a national figure during the war. Life magazine featured him in a detailed August 1943 article, showcasing both his genius and his abrasive personality. President Franklin D. Roosevelt visited the Higgins plant on September 29, 1942, during a secret nationwide tour of war production facilities. The visit was so classified that it was not reported in the press until October 2nd. Roosevelt toured the PT boat facility in a convertible automobile with Higgins, Louisiana Governor Sam Houston Jones, and Rear Admiral Frank T. Layton, 8th Naval District Commandant. Higgins explained the company's role in the war effort using ship models while seated alongside the president. Once the security blackout lifted, photographs of the visit appeared in newspapers nationwide, making Higgins's face recognizable to millions of Americans. Throughout the war, Higgins received numerous awards and commendations from the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. His company earned the Army-Navy E Award multiple times, the highest honor bestowed on civilian companies for excellence in war production. The flags representing these awards flew proudly over his plants, and workers wore A-pins with pride, understanding that the recognition belonged to their collective efforts as much as to their employer. Higgins held roughly 30 patents related to landing craft and amphibious vehicles. His innovations in hull design, most notably the protected propeller tunnel and the spoon-shaped bow, were secured by U.S. Patent 2700-111, filed December 24, 1937, and issued January 17, 1939. The ball ramp design, a decisive feature in amphibious assaults, was covered by U.S. Patent 2341-166, filed December 8, 1941, and issued February 15, 1944. These inventions ensured that Higgins' contributions to modern warfare were not only immediate but enduring, shaping the conduct of amphibious operations for generations to come. These patents represented the culmination of years of hands-on experience navigating the treacherous bayous of Louisiana, transformed brilliantly for military use through collaboration with Marine Corps officers like Victor Krulak, who recognized the strategic value of Japanese innovations. Yet Higgins' personality remained as combative as ever throughout the war. He clashed constantly with the Navy's Bureau of Ships, who never forgave him for repeatedly proving that a civilian with practical knowledge could outdesign their career engineers. He battled unions, viewing organized labor as a threat to his direct relationship with workers and to maximum wartime production. He fought competitors whom he believed enjoyed preferential treatment in contract awards. His language remained profane, his management confrontational, and his confidence in his own abilities absolute. Workers either loved him or hated him, but nearly all respected him. He paid well, promoted based on merit, regardless of race or gender, and demanded excellence from everyone, including himself. Higgins's relationship with his workforce grew increasingly fraught over union issues. As the war progressed, he opposed unions openly and aggressively, believing they interfered with production efficiency and the company's direct bond with employees. When unions attempted to organize his plants, he resisted fiercely, sometimes in ways that skirted federal labor law. Strikes and work stoppages enraged him. He could not understand why workers would jeopardize the war effort over wages and conditions he considered generous. This ongoing conflict would later contribute significantly to the post-war decline of Higgins Industries. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Navy began canceling contracts for boats no longer needed in Europe. The Japanese surrender in August, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, accelerated these cancellations. By October 11, 1945, all military contracts for boats had been terminated. Higgins Industries had built its entire operation around maximum wartime production, employing more than 20,000 workers across 7 plants. Suddenly, the orders vanished. Higgins attempted to pivot to civilian production, building pleasure craft and exploring consumer products. He tried aircraft manufacturing contracts for Curtiss C-76 Caravans and C-46 Commandos were canceled before significant production could begin, with only 2 C-46A aircraft completed before the contract was terminated on August 10, 1944. He experimented with helicopter designs, building one prototype in 1946, and proposed prefabricated housing and consumer appliances for the post-war boom. None of these ventures generated the revenues necessary to sustain the business. Union troubles intensified as workers, who had tolerated grueling wartime conditions, now demanded higher wages and better working conditions in peacetime. Higgins, who had little sympathy for labor during the war, was even less accommodating afterward. In early June 1945, he announced that roughly a few hundred workers at the City Park plant would be laid off as orders declined. By mid-August, with most military contracts canceled, he declared that 2/3 of employees would lose their jobs. In late October, he announced the closure of all remaining plants in New Orleans, planning to reopen under a new business model where employment would not depend on union affiliation or dues. On November 9, 1945, Andrew Higgins liquidated Higgins Industries, the company that had once employed 25,000 workers and produced over 20,000 boats, was shuttered. In January 1946, Higgins formed a new company, Higgins Incorporated, focused on pleasure boats and limited commercial production, with his brother Frank directing marketing through Higgins Marine Sales Corporation. But the magic was gone. By 1948, only the industrial canal plant remained, and mounting debts plagued the struggling enterprise. Andrew Higgins died on August 1, 1952, at the age of 65, following a week-long hospitalization for stomach ulcers, before suffering a fatal stroke. His death came just 7 years after the war ended, at a time when his company was faltering and his personal fortune largely depleted. His sons Ed, Andrew Jr., Frank, and Roland tried to continue the business through the 1950s, but financial pressures proved insurmountable. In 1959, 7 years after Higgins's death, the company was sold to New York Ship. Higgins' post-war struggles could not erase the fact that during the war, his vision, ingenuity, and relentless drive had helped reshape modern amphibious warfare. The Higgins Boat had carried tens of thousands of Allied soldiers across hostile beaches, altered the strategy of entire campaigns, and earned him a permanent place in the annals of military history. One of Higgins's factories in New Orleans found a remarkable second life in 1961 when it was converted into NASA's Michoud Assembly Facility, where it would produce Saturn V rocket stages and Space Shuttle external tanks. Yet the enduring legacy of Andrew Higgins and his boats extended far beyond the walls of any factory or the lifespan of his company. His invention fundamentally changed the way wars were fought. The Axis powers had fortified ports along the Atlantic Wall and clustered their strongest defenses where they expected the Allies to strike. The Allies simply sidestepped these defenses, landing on beaches between fortified ports, using Higgins boats to put troops ashore precisely where the defenses were weakest. In the Pacific, Japanese forces had fortified their islands around harbors and airfields. Americans, however, landed on coral beaches away from these strong points, establishing beachheads that expanded faster than Japanese counterattacks could respond. The strategic impact was profound. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, the invasions of North Africa and Italy, the Normandy landings, and the advance into Germany all depended on Higgins boats to carry assault troops. The brilliance of the Higgins boat lay in the seamless integration of its features. The spoon-shaped bow rode over obstacles rather than smashing into them. The protected propeller allowed the boat to beach and reverse without fouling. The planning hull provided speed and maneuverability, while the steel bow ramp let troops charge directly onto the sand. Each innovation addressed a specific challenge. Together, they produced a craft that could land soldiers under fire, reverse off cleanly, and return for more, repeatedly, in all conditions. These boats conquered coral atolls in the Pacific, sandy shores in North Africa and the pebbled beaches of Normandy, because Higgins understood boats at their most fundamental level. He had built them for years to survive the harsh, debris-laden bayous of Louisiana, and when the military faced the harshest conditions imaginable, Higgins already had the solution. The numbers tell the story clearly. Total LCVP production reached 23,358 boats, with Higgins Industries itself building 20,094, including 12,500 LCVPs. On D-Day alone, 156,000 Allied troops were landed, including 34,000 Americans at Omaha Beach, all achieved without capturing a single port, using beaches previously deemed unsuitable for major operations. The impact on the war was incalculable. Lives were saved because troops could disembark quickly via a ramp. Instead of climbing over sides under fire, operations succeeded that would have failed with conventional landing craft, and victories came faster because forces could be built ashore more quickly than the enemy could respond. Higgins' contributions were recognized long after the war. In 2000, a 7-block section of Howard Avenue in New Orleans was renamed Andrew Higgins Drive. A memorial was dedicated in his hometown of Columbus, Nebraska in 2001, and in May 2019, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans prominently features Higgins boats, the museum chosen specifically because the city had been home to Higgins Industries. Restored boats are displayed in museums nationwide, iconic symbols of American industrial ingenuity and the capacity to solve complex problems at scale. Higgins's wartime factories also left a social legacy. His fully integrated workforce, where black and white workers labored side by side for equal pay, demonstrated that racial segregation was unnecessary for industrial efficiency, a lesson that resonated during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The story of the Higgins boat exemplifies the power of practical experience over theoretical expertise. The Navy's Bureau of Ships had spent 20 years failing to design an effective landing craft. Higgins, through trial and error and hands-on experience, solved the problem in months. He built boats to meet real challenges under the harshest conditions, proving that civilians with specialized knowledge could outpace military bureaucracies, a realization that influenced military procurement for decades. Today, a restored Higgins boat sits outside the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Its plywood sides, protected propeller tunnel, and steel bow ramp look modest, almost unremarkable. It is hard to imagine this small craft crossing the English Channel in rough seas and landing soldiers under fire on Normandy beaches. But thousands of these boats did exactly that, day after day, until victory was secured. Andrew Higgins died on August 1, 1952, at age 65, his company defunct and his fortune depleted. He is buried at Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans. Yet his boats carried millions of Americans into combat and directly enabled Allied victory. Nearly 2 decades after the war in 1964, Dwight Eisenhower reflected on Higgins' impact. "He's the man who won the war for us. If Andy Higgins hadn't designed and built these landing craft, we never could have gone in over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. Indeed, the humble plywood ramp had done what seemed impossible. It won the war."